Now, our speaker tonight, Terry Bishop Sterling, is a native of St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, was educated at Memorial University and at Queen's University in Kingston. She taught in Memorial's history department for over 35 years, including 5 years as head of the department. And I'm sure there are people in this room who came into contact with her and her wonderful mind during the time they were in university. Terry has written articles and presented papers on Newfoundland's social and political history with emphasis on health and welfare policy, women's history, and the history of volunteerism. She is an active public historian who speaks to interested groups on many different aspects of the province's history. She has served on the executive of the Newfoundland Labrador Historical Society for over 30 years, including a term as president, and she survived. And she is currently the editor of Aspects, the Society's contribution to the Newfoundland Quarterly. And again, I would suggest if anyone has an article that they feel might be a contribution to the history of our province, contact Terry and maybe they can arrange to have it part of the quarterly in the Aspects section. Terry has published many articles. Some relevant to the talk tonight are, she co-authored with Jeff Webb the chapter on the 20th century for the Historical Society's Short History of Newfoundland and Labrador. Such sites one will never forget: Newfoundland Nursing and Overseas Service in the First World War, in Sarah Glassford and Amy Shaw editors, A Sisterhood of Suffering and Service, Women and Girls of Canada and Newfoundland During the First World War, published in 2012. She contributed 2 pieces for the 1914-18 online International Encyclopedia of the First World War, and which were Women's Mobilization for War, Newfoundland, and the Home Front, Newfoundland. Now, the talk tonight is on the same kind of topic, but it adds something different. The title is, I Couldn't See Why a Woman Couldn't Go to War Too. This is, again, about Newfoundland women in overseas service in the First World War. So, Terry, without further ado, the microphone's yours. Thank you.
How's this? Can everybody hear me well? Thanks for inviting me here tonight. This is a topic that, as Pat said, I've researched for a very long time. It kind of comes and goes. I go on to other things and then I get back to it, or somebody sends me something. Pat mentioned that we have viewers from all over the world. A gentleman emailed me this morning. He said he wasn't going to be able to make it, but was hoping it would be posted because he's in Germany and his great aunt was a Newfoundland nurse during the First World War, and he's currently going through her papers. So keep holding out hope. The title today, I changed the title from one that I've used in the past just to change some things up, but the title is from Jeanette Coltis, later Wells, who was a VAD in the First World War. And this is from a little reminiscence that she published in 1954, looking back on her time. She was working as a store clerk in St. John's for George Noling, and he told her she was foolish. Her father didn't want her to go, but her boyfriend had gone, her brothers had gone, and she couldn't see why a woman couldn't go to war too. So she was quite determined to go. One of the funny quotes from her, the reminiscence is, as often these things often are, it's a bit romanticized, but she does tell sort of some of the good things and the bad things. One of her very first challenges when she was training in St. John's was washing men's feet. And with their knobbly old feet and their knobbly toes, she thought it was just disgusting, but she had to hide it. Of course, compared to what she would see, that wasn't really all that much, but she was determined that she was going to go, so she had to put up with the knobbly feet of the men. Oh dear. This is not working again. So we're having a little trouble with this keyboard. Ah, this one. Well,
Yep. Yep.
okay. These women are two Newfoundland nurses, and I should kind of have a first definition and word about sources. The word nurse was used. It was used on the wards. It was used in the time. It's been used since to refer to people. People often talk about Newfoundland nurse Fanny Clewett. People know a lot about Fanny Clewett, and I'll talk a little bit about her tonight, but her letters have been published quite a few years ago now, by Bert Riggs and Romke, Bill Romke, and she was a VAD from Bellorum, and but VADs were not nurses exactly, and some of them were including Sybil, were very often would say, I was not a nurse, I didn't want to be a nurse. VADs were essentially nurses' aides. The VAD stands for Voluntary Aid Detachment, and that was an organization founded in Britain in 1909, so that in the event of the war, there were women that were meant to go into civilian hospitals to free up nurses to work in military hospitals. So very kind of limited role. When the war started, the idea was that they would go in and do, because of course nurses, they didn't have all the hierarchy of hospital staff that we have now, and nurses made the meals, did everything. So the idea was that these VADs would come in and do a lot of the domestic work, thus freeing up the nurses. And over time, you did see that role expand quite a bit. There you go. That's better. Yeah. There, we're getting there. Sorry. So these women were organized under the Red Cross and St. John Ambulance, mainly St. John Ambulance here. In Britain, the Red Cross and St. John Ambulance kind of coordinated their efforts. So here it started under the Red Cross. It was very much, there was a branch of the Newfoundland Patriotic Association, which organized the whole war effort and recruited men, that was responsible for non-combatant recruits. But very early on, basically, that they turned that over to some of the sort of leading women of St. John's, including Lady Davidson, the wife of the governor, and Adeline Browning was very much involved. And they really kind of recruited women. They welcomed Outport women when they came into St. John's, took them to tea, and organized their training. So they got a few weeks training in first aid. One of the people that I think is kind of overlooked a little bit in this is Cluny McPherson's wife, or to Eleanor. And she was very involved. And she was one of the people that helped train some of these women in their first aid. So they spent a few weeks there. Early in the war, they would also spend a few weeks in the hospitals under a nurse, getting a little bit of training that way. As the war went on, this training got a little bit compressed as they were needed more and more. So those are the VADs. And we actually have more on the VADs, and that's an interesting story in itself, which I'll talk about in a minute. But other than that, we're also talking about nurses. And here we see two nurses, Newfoundland nurses. On the right there, a little pointy chin, is Maisie Parsons. And I have a couple of letters from Maisie. And I think that's Mabel Cron, both Harbor Grace women who signed up, and they served with the Canadian Army Medical Corps. So the Newfoundland nurses that served with various groups, but primarily either the Canadians or Queen Alexandra's International Medical Service. Let me get this again. Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Services. I'm just going to call them the QAs, which was the British sources. So they weren't quite the same. These were trained nurses, and they took charge of wards. They went into operating rooms and that kind of thing. Now, numbers. I've seen the numbers high as 200 quoted for Newfoundland women who served overseas. I think that's probably high, but I don't know. I could be wrong. My research has mainly been on women that left here during the war. So there were certainly women who were born in Newfoundland and moved as children, and some people have added them into the numbers. But there were also quite a lot of women who had been working elsewhere. As we know, it was a very mobile labor force. The School of Nursing here only opened in 1903, so there were certainly a number of Newfoundland women who had wanted to be a nurse and trained elsewhere, and some of them joined up through American private sources early in the war, through the Canadians, through the Brits. So over the years, since I published the original article on that, I keep learning about more of them. There's a woman, Mona Loader, who Margot Dooley believes to be the first Newfoundland nurse who served overseas. She arrived in France a full 10 months before the Newfoundland Regiment landed in Gallipoli. And she had trained in London at the London Hospital, very prestigious, and that may have helped her get to the front pretty early. Margot wrote a two-part article for Aspects on that, which is one of the ones that's actually posted on our website under publications. And you can see past aspects. So if you want to read that, that's quite an interesting story. So two kinds of women served. Now the sources. There are the official sources, which have their records that say, when they signed off, have a description of them, how long they served, where they served, any sort of notes on them. So that's helpful for numbers and that kind of thing. Doesn't tell you an awful lot about their experience or how they felt. We have a couple of very important collections in the archives and special collections at Memorial. One is Fanny Klewitt's letters, which, as I say, have been published. Then there's a much bigger collection, which Heidi Coombs and I have been working on for quite a long time and hope to publish, and that is the records of Sybil Johnson, and I'll introduce Sybil now in a minute. Sybil wrote almost every day in her 19 months overseas. So she's quite a different person and had quite a different experience than Fanny. So I'll maybe draw a little bit more on her. I know her a lot more, and we do have a lot of her sources. There's also, excuse me, in the same archive, a photo album by Ruby Eyre, who was a VAD, and then later in the war also was an ambulance driver. So there's some pictures from her as well. On top of that, there are a few things published. There are a couple letters published in the newspaper from Maisie Parsons that I can talk about a little later. There's, say, some reminiscences. And there are occasionally a letter or something turns up in some other source. So I found some letters, for example, from Janet Miller Eyre in her husband who died in the war, Eric Eyre's regimental files. So little bits and pieces to try and fill it out. So I will draw pretty heavily on the sources that are the richest. Unfortunately, those are pretty exclusively VADs rather than nurses. And the VAD story gets told a lot more, and that's not unique to Newfoundland. It is there in the academic literature, it's everywhere. And they just seem to have left more records. In Britain, there was a lot of suspicion of VADs by nurses, and this is one of the sort of academic discussions, is conflict between nurses and VADs and the threat of VADs posed to nurses. And what you have to realize is nursing was really still a fairly new profession, and actually they were fighting for professional status. In Britain at the time, there was not a nursing registry, so they couldn't even control, who was listed as a nurse and with what training. So they were a bit worried about all these women coming in with just a few weeks training and everybody lauding them as nurses. And so that was a big thing in Britain. The other big thing in Britain, and there had been a history of this from earlier wars, is that there was definitely a big class divide between the nurses and the VADs in Britain. I think that's a big issue in Britain. It's a smaller issue in Canada, and I think it's a smaller issue again here, because I think the divide between the backgrounds of the nurses and the VADs was just not quite as wide. It's also in Britain been dominated very much by the experience of Vera Brittain, a very famous VAD who was a pacifist and wrote novels, semi-biographical novels after the war. And her experience, which is very bitter and is sort of taken to be the VAD experience. But she was a very upper-class young woman training to go into Oxford before the war, a very erudite and very passionate. And she lost her brother, she lost loved ones, including a fiance, I think, or a boyfriend anyway, during the war, and this all shaped her experience. And certainly the story of VADs is often kind of shaped by that. One of the things I did in my research was read through the British Journal of Nursing for the war period. And certainly there was suspicion of the VADs, particularly at the beginning of the war. But by the end of the war, you see more and more letters from nurses saying, I don't know how I could manage without these girls. I don't know how I could manage without their help. So they did come to appreciate how much they needed them. So why did they join up? Why do these sometimes very well-off, very privileged young women choose to put themselves in danger and leave their comfortable homes and go overseas to do what was often very hard work? Certainly there was recruitment. You see this VAD poster here. So nursing members, cooks, kitchen hands, clerks, housemaids, ward maids, laundresses. So there was advertising that way. Now, in the early stages of the war, the British authorities didn't even want nurses from the colonies, certainly not VADs. Mary Southcott, the head of the School of Nursing, the founder of the School of Nursing here, gave a talk in 1915, and she said, definitely they don't want any untrained women. And even the nurses, she said, you have to wait to be asked. So that was a little bit of an issue because, of course, the war was going to be over by Christmas. And some of the nurses at the General Hospital actually got their medical director, Dr. Keegan, to write to the governor and ask if they could go. And so he did follow up for them. And he was told that there was a surplus of nurses in England. And so they didn't want these nurses. So by certainly the spring of 1916, they had changed their tunes, and they're recruiting both nurses and VADs in the colonies. This is sort of a classic image of the time, the Red Cross posters. So against this, we don't need any help. You shouldn't go if you're not trained. You had stories of, sometimes inflated stories of Belgian atrocities, and along with actually the same issue of the local newspaper that had Mary Southcott's speech, there was a story about a Belgian woman, tending to the sick and bringing dainties to the sick and taking care of them on the battlefront. So these kinds of images and this idea of, the greatest mother in the world was really very appealing to a lot of people. Certainly, both nurses and VADs included women who were looking for adventure. That may have been part of the motivation, but the evidence supports the findings of historians in Britain and Canada that most were driven by a strong sense of patriotic duty. Like their counterpart elsewhere, they did not see why they couldn't follow their brothers, boyfriends, and friends overseas, sometimes against their family's wishes. And as I said, Coltis was discouraged. I believe Sybil Johnson was discouraged as well. Now, for the graduate nurses, caring for men on the battlefield was at the very foundation of their training. Florence Nightingale, of course, and her work in the Crimea. So many of them wanted to go. Nurse Bertha Forsey stated that she had signed up with the encouragement of Miss Southcott. Some of the nurses didn't wait when they were turned down initially. Maisie Parsons, what was in the previous slide there, she had connections. Her brother was a doctor with Canadian Army Medical Corps, and she managed to get on with a group going out of the Victoria Hospital in Montreal, and she left in 1915. Even some VADs didn't want to wait. If they had their own means, they just went to England and signed up there. So one of them was Janet Miller Eyre, who I mentioned. She followed her fiance overseas, and she joined the VAD over there. Another was Ethel Dickinson, but you had to have the means because you were on your own dime. And Ethel ran a business school for women. And just in 1914, actually, maybe this helped, she was related to a very wealthy man, William Pitt, I believe, who died around that time and left her a legacy of £2,000. So maybe with that, she could take the risk of going overseas. So some of them just didn't wait, and they got overseas. But as I say, by the spring of 1916, they were certainly recruiting. This is Fanny Clewett, in her dress uniform, looking very smart. Dorothy Eyre, she and I think her cousin Ruby were both VADs, and Ruby left the photograph album, and I do have some images from that later. This is VAD. So typically, you know, they would serve meals. That was a very common thing that they did. And you can see the trolley there. And this is from Eyre's album. This is a great, I know it's kind of grainy, but I do love this image. This is Armine Gosling, not the suffragette leader, but her daughter, who was an ambulance driver. Ambulance drivers were probably the women that got closest to the action. Mona Loder, who I mentioned earlier, who Margot Dooley wrote about, she was complaining in 1915 that she wasn't allowed to get within 5 miles of the action. And later in her career, because they wouldn't let the trained nurses do that, but later in her career, she did get to drive an ambulance. I've always loved this photograph. So this is an image from Ascot Convalescent Hospital, where Ruby Eyre served. And again, you see a lot of officers there, and this was more of a convalescent hospital. Now, as I said, there were many historians have written about the class and professional rivalries between the nurses and the VADs. And many nurses certainly resented, and you can see that they might, the fact that patients and much of the general public referred to VADs as nurses, but others admitted that they needed help. Newfoundland nurse Bertha Forsey described the VADs under her as great girls. You don't see any complaints by Fanny Clewett about the nurses who she served under, but we only have a handful of letters from Fanny Clewett. We don't have that sort of dailiness. We certainly get that with Sybil Johnson. Let's get to the picture. This is Sybil. So Sybil Johnson, as I said, that's who I've done the most work on with Heidi in the last few years. Sybil was the daughter of Supreme Court Justice. They moved in the circles of Government House, so they were about as upper class as you were going to get in St. John's. She had gone to a Cheltenham's finishing school for young ladies in Britain, and she had studied music in Leipzig. She was a very accomplished violinist. There's lots of stories in the newspapers early in the 20th century of her being praised very highly for her playing at concerts for various events. She's particularly involved. A favorite of hers was the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. She was very involved in that. So a very kind of privileged young woman. Not the kind that you might, in the first instance, think is going to go off to war. She was born in 1887. And at the time that the war started, she was engaged to a young up-and-coming lawyer named Brian Dunfield, who went on to have a huge career in public service in Newfoundland and was eventually knighted. So she later became Lady Dunfield. She and her sister Jill joined the VAD in 1916, and Sybil went on to serve for 19 months at the First Western Military Hospital in or near Liverpool. So she was a very dutiful daughter, wrote almost daily, and we have over 300 of her letters. So you do certainly see some, I really bemoan the fact that, that a lot of history these days, everybody's described as, heroes and villains and good guys and bad guys. And you could read some of her letters and really like her and really sympathize with her, and then read others and think, oh my, what an awful snob. And she was both. She certainly was a creature of her background. She was a very sentimental, romantic woman. She wrote poetry, and she often talked about, different poets and that kind of thing. She, when she joined up, though, I think, Heidi and I have talked about this, she did again mention, I must do my duty. I couldn't bear to be a shirker, was one of her lines. But we think that this was also maybe a little moment of rebellion. Her father didn't want her to go. Brian Dunfield didn't want her to go. And I think this was maybe a little bit of time that she was going to go and be her own person before she left her father's house and went to her husband's house. And that's a very different, even though she wasn't that much younger than Fanny Clewett. Fanny Clewett was very much her own person. She was a teacher. Her father had already died. She and her mother were running the house. She just comes across very much as, a mature woman, accountable to nobody but herself, kind of thing. Sybil's letters to her parents sometimes aren't that different sounding than the ones she wrote as a schoolgirl from finishing school, because we have those letters as well. So in my sources, the only VAD who sometimes expressed resentment for nurses' authorities was Sybil Johnson. Even in this case, however, it was not a consistent complaint. And it's most obvious in her last weeks of service. She was definitely running out of steam toward the end. Through most of her service, she got along well with her superiors. She rarely complained that a task was beneath her, but occasionally chafed at what she considered needless rules. She also resented what she considered cold or unfair treatment, tellingly remarking that a servant would not stand for such treatment. Her background did come out at times. And so as an example of this, when she returned from her last leave in the spring of 19, Johnson's complaints increased. A lot of it really had to do with the personalities of the nurses that were over her. She really respected some of them and really liked them. She didn't mind if they were tough, as long as they were efficient and, and really, as she thought, respectful. Others she thought were just tyrants. She had always enjoyed playing the piano or her fiddle, as she wrote, for the men, and they enjoyed that. Concerts on the wards were not uncommon. When she came back from her last one, the new matron on the ward forbade music on the ward. So that's the kind of, she thought, unfair and needless rule. And to make matters worse, she soon got on the wrong side of one of the ward sisters. She concluded that the reprimands she received were based on class and professional jealousy. And she wrote, "The sisters, most of them like to pretend the VADs are practically servants because most of us are what they would consider grand in their natural sphere of life. And they really are fearfully jealous if any of us play or sing. They think that the officers are something grand and just dread their being nice to us. Matron thinks we have all come nursing with the fixed intention of ensnaring one of these young gods." So it could come out. Another time she complained about she'd gotten a reprimand. One time she got a reprimand for leaving a duster on the end of the bed, and she said, I was wrong. So she was fine with that. But another time a nurse that she really disliked said something to her about, something about how she had prepared the tea. And she said, she doesn't understand that you would not lay the table for tea like that at 5 o'clock. So, it did show. On the other hand, she did a lot of hard work. And I'm going to have to just skip ahead a little bit here to a quote. I'm sorry, I had a little bit of printer problem yesterday, so I thought I would, so I'm going to have to kind of go to the quotes here, because I don't have them separately. Yesterday, I began by helping with breakfast, clearing the ward for sweeping, and afterwards dusting it. Got off at 9:30 and went on at 12:45 when I got dinners and took them in, including a walk to another kitchen across the way for a heavy tray of pudding sauce. Then tidied the wards again, washed and boiled bandages, got tea and cleared them, counted and stowed laundry, helped hoist in and out a boy, minus a leg. At her hospital, there were a lot of amputees. I think it might have been a specialization at that hospital, in his bath chair. And then he went for a push with a friend, also a patient. Came here for tea, this is a sitting room in another part of the building, rushed back and stretched my wet bandages to dry, which kept me standing for an hour. Made up about 10 beds with another nurse, which meant carrying PASA sheets, etc. Then found it was 7 o'clock and rushed over here for the ambulance. One day, much like the other. This is January 1917. She only started right after Christmas in 1917. So this was early on. So, very much domestic idea. They rushed over to get the ambulance. She and her sister were lucky ones. They were staying at a convent about 8 miles from the hospital. No, not as far as that. A few miles from the hospital, and an ambulance would take them back and forth. So they were pretty comfortable there, actually, compared to some. Jeanette Coltis talks about being so cold in the hostel that she stayed in near Wandsworth, and particularly the rats. And when she took over her room, the girl who was leaving said, "Now make sure you take care of so-and-so and so-and-so." And she said, "Who do you mean?" She said, "Oh, they're my pet mice." And Jeanette promptly caught them and disposed of them. But she hated the rats, and she said that was the worst thing about the whole experience. But the Johnsons were fairly comfortable. They also, of course, did not rely on their very meager pay as VADs. Jeanette Coltis tells a funny story about that. She said she was trying to make friends with a British VAD who was down the hall from her, and she'd always kind of been rebuffed. And then she found out that the girl thought she was a Canadian, making the pricely sum of $1.25 a day instead of a shilling a day. So the Canadians were paid about 4 to 5 times more than the British VADs. And she, once she found out I was just on a lowly level like her, then we became great friends. So these kind of distinctions did matter. Neither Coltis nor Cluett complained about their unfair treatment by nurses, but the sources, a nostalgic reminiscence, and just a handful of letters makes comparison difficult. If we had daily letters from Coltis and Cluett, they might tell far more complex stories, which reveal more of their own strengths, weaknesses, doubts, and paint a fuller and more nuanced picture of the women who served with them. Now, they all had to adjust to war work. Hospital and military authority was not the only or most difficult adjustment for nurses and VADs. Newfoundland nurses who served overseas with the British forces spent some time in military hospitals in Britain before serving at the front, and this likely provided a very important transition. Bertha Forsey spent 2 years as a nurse at Catterick, a military hospital in Yorkshire, before being sent to France. At Catterick, she assisted in the operating room. She was in charge of a ward of German prisoners of war and cared for servicemen suffering from shell shock. Her reminiscence is told in a professional, kind of matter-of-fact way, and when you do get accounts from nurses, they do tend to be that way. The journal of Mona Loder that Margot based her article on, very matter-of-fact, brief entries. So she, as I said, told in a matter-of-fact tone. But she took pride in the skills she learned, including training in anesthesia. As I said, she did treat German prisoners of war who were kept in a separate building. And she did say that, generally they were treated okay, but there was a flu epidemic. I'm not sure if it was an early strain of the Spanish flu. And she said, oh, the German prisoners had to be pretty much at death doors before they brought them into the main hospital. Similarly, Maisie Parsons, who served with Canadian Services in Belgium, described the wound she saw as dreadful, but interesting. And that was in a letter to, it was 2 letters from her. One is to Keegan, the director, her former boss, the medical director of the, Dr. Keegan of the General Hospital. And she said he would find it interesting. And then the one to her father, where she talks more about the horrors of war. And I have a little quote from her a little later. While nurses were certainly empathetic to their patients, their training helped them to maintain a certain emotional distance, and more work could bring the satisfaction of learning new skills and the reward of being trusted with greater responsibility than they could have achieved as quickly at civilian hospitals. A lot of them are very recent graduates. Sybil notes, actually, that when she went into the operating room one time just to help with a patient, sort of hold his hand as he was going under, she made a note. She said the anesthesiologist was a girl, more than likely a nurse. And that is one of the things that did happen when the war went on, is a lot of nurses were trained to be anesthetists. Even for nurses, however, the steady stream of young, maimed, and dying men must have stretched their professional coping skills quite a bit. And very early in the war, Edith Cavell Home for Nurses was established for respite for nurses and for ill nurses. And many nurses certainly did become ill during the war. I think about 600 died with direct enemy action, many more from disease, dysentery, other kinds of diseases. Obviously, late in the war, the Spanish flu. Certainly those who served on hospital ships were always at risk for being torpedoed. So their skills were, no matter how much they were trained, it must have been a strain. For VADs who had come to do domestic work and to soothe the brows of bedridden soldiers, the adjustments to the horror of war must have been even more difficult. They worked up to 12-hour shifts with a couple of hours off each day. Their experience varied. They wrote letters and shopped for the men. That was something that Sybil quite liked to do. Performed basic housekeeping chores, helped with dressings, and sometimes even assisted at operations. Frances Clewett also mentioned simply, or not so simply, being told to sit with a man while he died. Both Clewett and Johnson made particular note of the first time they assisted with dressings. This was perhaps the most common VAD nursing task. It was, therefore, a vote of confidence from supervising sisters and marked the VAD's transition from solely domestic help to nursing help. Clewett's introduction came only 5 days after she arrived at the Lincoln Hospital, her first post. Perhaps it was a little too early, as she fainted when she saw the wound revealed. This is the only time that she describes herself fainting on duty, but admitted that sometimes she had to turn her head away. Johnson was not asked to help with dressings until she had been on duty for 3 months. She described being on the trolley with Sister for the first time and felt she had performed well, but some dressings were harder than others. She recounted helping with a dressing with a man with a fractured spine. The man had sores all down his back, and it was altogether a fearful and repulsive business. I hadn't much to do but hold him steady when I helped roll him over on his side. He was a Scotchman and so game and plucky, and kept talking away to me and held my arm. His hand was like a firebrand. He had a high temp. In a way, I was glad to help, but it was horrible. That last sentence, there's a lot of sentences like that through all of the writing that I've seen. It was so awful, and I don't know how I could bear it, but I wouldn't have changed. I wouldn't have not gone for anything. You see a lot of that in both the nurses and VAD work. Johnson later found it hard to watch as this man died with his wife and young daughter by his side. Apart from the difficult medical tasks, nurses would have been accustomed to performing very personal services for their patients. The young, well-bred women of the VAD would not have been exposed to such tasks. And they found this almost as difficult to deal with as the wounds, some of them. There is, knobbly men's feet, of course. Ideally, military hospitals in both England and at the front had male orderlies to help move men, to bathe them, deal with bedpans, and to administer other personal services considered not quite proper for women to undertake. For Johnson, bathing the men and dealing with the bedpans was the worst parts of the job. While the matter-of-fact Clewett simply mentioned these things as part of a general description of a day's work, Johnson was horrified. Occasionally, all the orderlies would be called away or reassigned or called up, a practice Johnson complained about bitterly. In April 1917, she explained to her mother that since the orderlies were gone, all sorts of appalling jobs fall on us, and I truly can't face them. You know my leaning to primness. It's very interesting to me that she wrote this was one of the days that she wrote both her mother and father separately. She doesn't say anything like this in the letter to her father. This was a letter to her mother. The letter to her father is filled with comic antics of some of the patients instead. So that may be, she didn't want to discuss these things with her father, or she knew that he didn't want her to be there, and so she was kind of censoring herself there. Though she claimed to adjust to hide her discomfort from the patients, Johnson continued to hate this part of the work. When she learned in June that her ward would be getting orderly, she announced it in a letter which opened with, "I burst with joy." No more BPs, she said. Living conditions and work itself was harder closer to the front. Clewett did not have the professional training of Parsons or Forsey. I should actually just do this little one from... I should just mention that, as I say, she was engaged to Brian Dunfield. And several times throughout her letter, she said, Brian's hoping to be able to enlist in a couple of months. And, it's too bad Brian can't come. Brian was, John may know this, but that at the time he had been commissioned to collate and organize all the older statutes of Newfoundland. So he was been given this big legal task. As I say, he was an up-and-coming young lawyer. So he never did enlist. At one point she said, unless he enlists, she's not marrying him. She did. So you don't know how I long to hear that Brian is coming over, though I shall be scared stiff, needless to say. But it is no use. A soldier is the only man who counts nowadays among the physically fit, and I always feel he should be one. It is so unfair that he can't have his chance. So she was not too happy. She compared that very unfavorably with her friend who she corresponded with and whose picture she had on her bureau, Phil Jensen, who was a Newfoundlander wounded on duty in the war. Her brother Mac also served, so she was very worried about him. She mentioned about being one of the things that she wrote a lot about. I think a real fear of her, which was torpedoes. She was very nervous crossing the ocean, and she would always write about, I heard that this hospital ship was torpedoed, so she was very afraid of that. And this is from Coltis. So as I say, there's a lot of funny little things in Jeanette Coltis's reminiscence, but she also talked about how hard it was. There were so many boys coming in all the time that we kept going at top speed and fell into bed at night exhausted. We had to feed the blind and write letters for them. My heart used to break just to see them, but usually I was too busy rushing around and doing things for them to even think of whether I had a heart. So there's a lot of things like that as well, interspersed with some of her more funny things. She tells a great story about, again, the mice and the rats. One day there was the ward sister told her and another girl to go fetch a cat because there was a rat making a terrible noise on the ward. And so they ran to get a cat, and then they finally found a cat and came back in. This big South African patient said, "Oh, that's not a rat, it's a weasel." And the other girl ran screaming from the room. And I said, "Don't you have weasels back in Newfoundland?" And she said, "We do have weasels, but they're in the woods. They don't come into your house and pretend to be rats." So there were things even worse than the rats, apparently. Living and working conditions were harder closer to the front. Fanny Clewett was very quickly actually promoted to go to the front. She was, again, VAD, but again, a very steady person, despite fainting that that first time with the bandages. She didn't have the professional training of Parsons or Forsey. So in Rouen, she had to draw on all her personal strength to help her patients and to preserve some peace for herself. On her second day there, she helped with a bad dressing. There was one man wounded in the thigh. There was a hole right through from side to side. It was like you cut it with an axe. You can read about war and the wounded, but when you are brought face to face with it, I tell you, it is heartrending. In Rouen, she also saw the immediate effects of poison gas. Clouet's remarkably candid letters from France lack both the professional distance of the trained nurses and the positive sort of nostalgic tone of Coltis's reminiscences. VAD work with them was quite difficult. For the nurses, though, too, they had to adjust. This is Maisie Parsons. This is a letter to her father. Although we are only 6 miles from she was in Belgium, in Le Pen, and this is quite early in the war. We were only 6 miles from the trenches. We never hear any news. The only thing we know is when there is a big battle on this end. We can hear the guns and see the flashes, and tonight, oh, it is simply terrible. It is just the same as thunder and lightning, and to think that every flash means so many deaths. It is horrible. We do get terrible cases in. I know if you saw the poor patients, you would wonder how they can possibly live. At home, you can't imagine what war is like, with the noises of the guns, the flashes and searchlights, zeppelins, airplanes, and warships out in the North Sea. It is impossible to sleep tonight. Lots of nights. Tonight I am writing you by the light of a candle. We can't get to sleep and have been watching the flashes of the guns, etc., all along the line for hours. It really seems like the fighting's all around us. Again, this last sentence, I am glad I came, but it certainly seems strange. Sort of dichotomy. The AD work was not all stress and sadness. Johnson and Clouet report on concerts on the wards, and they enjoyed shopping for treats for the men. They relied on family and friends for companionship and waited anxiously for mail. They also drew comfort from their passions, poetry and music for Johnson, and photography, painting, and gardening for Clouet. Clouet painted the scenes around her hospital camp and planted a garden to brighten her surroundings. She even sent home a slip from a rose tree she had planted. This may have been an attempt to preserve some memories from this extraordinary period in her life. They also made friends, sometimes in the trip over. So Clouet traveled with Henrietta Galashaw, and they became quite good friends and stayed close throughout the war and tried to, get time off together. Johnson, for the first while, had her sister Jill. Jill didn't last too long. She got anemic. She couldn't handle the stress. Sybil says she had a more disagreeable ward sister than she had. And she quit as a VAD nurse and went into general duty VAD work, helping at canteens and that kind of thing. And then she became friends with another woman there. There were 2 other Newfoundland women serving at the same hospital as Johnson. But she didn't particularly, she mentioned them, they were nice girls, but she didn't appear to be really close with them. The other thing that you see in all of them, nurses and VADs, is that they were always on the lookout for Newfoundland men. If Newfoundland men came into their hospital, it didn't happen a lot in Sybil's case. A lot of them were at Wandsworth. And whenever they would hear, even when they were at the hospitals on the front, that some Newfoundland men had been brought in, they would take their few hours off and go to try and find them and talk to them. Doug Wells, a member of our executive, sent me a couple of letters just earlier this week about a Newfoundland woman who she was a nurse, actually, from Harbour Breton, and I didn't know about her because she left again from Canada, I believe, and she had heard that there was a Newfoundland man from Harbour Breton at a hospital not too far from her. On her days off, she started going over to visit him. She wrote a letter for him to his mother. You saw a lot of that kind of behavior. It's one of the things that is believed to contribute to Ethel Dickinson's ultimate illness and death. Ethel Dickinson was posted I think at Ascot. And she would have her long days doing the kinds of things that was in that quote that I had from Sybil earlier. And she would spend all her off time going over to Wandsworth or any other hospital nearby and visiting the Newfoundland men and doing things for them and helping them. And she got herself exhausted. And she was sent home to rest. And then while she was home, the Spanish flu hit here. And anybody with medical training was called into the hospitals, and she went in and contracted flu, and she died of Spanish flu. So you do see that all the time. Clwyd had a dear cousin who was killed in the war, and she was always asking about him. And again, she said, she's hearing news, although the regiment is being so cut up. I don't know how they're going to hang on. So that's a sort of a common thing that this desire to hear about their countrymen was common in all of them. Even at their lowest times, Johnson and Clwyd were clearly glad that they had come. During her last few unhappy weeks in Liverpool, Johnson asserted that she never could have forgiven herself if she had shirked her duty and stayed home. For Clwyd, the last months of the war only increased the horror around her. In March and April 1918, German bombers struck several hospitals and casualty clearing stations, increasing the load on the rest. Her hospital became, in effect, a clearing station. Patient numbers increased dramatically, and she had to adjust to the severity of wounds as men came straight from the fighting without even the initial little bit of cleaning and treatment she was used to. She didn't complain about her work, but worried that the staff simply could not keep up and that the boys were dying, waiting for attention. Despite her distress, Clwyd's sense of duty prevailed. The letter closed, "Nothing would induce me to give it up, Mother." And she stayed, actually, after the end of the war. She ended up going to the Eastern Front and serving for a little bit longer as well. Another person that we know served for a while was Janet Miller-Eyre. And as I say, Janet went very early. She had the means to go. She had already bucked authority by bucking the Law Society's ban on women studying the law, and she was a law student. When the war started, and she was engaged to Eric Eyre, and when the war started, she decided that she wanted to serve, so she went overseas and she joined the VAD in Britain. Her mother was there and her mother-in-law. She lost both Eric, her fiance, and her brother, her only brother. And she spent the rest of the war taking care of the two mothers and really kind of comforting them. This is a letter she wrote to Hugh Anderson, who is an interesting character. He was the payroll director of the payroll office for the Newfoundland Regiment, and he seems to have been a very empathetic man, a young man. He tried to track down details for all kinds of families. They would write him, "Can you tell us more? Can you tell us more about our boy? Can you find out where he is?" And he would always try to follow up. So there's a series of letters between her and Hugh. She says, "I thank you very much for your letter of the 14th. The next time I am in London, I'm going to see about passports. We hope the Newfoundland members of the Graves Commission are opposing the plan of marking all graves with white stones. In 50 years, when all the women whose hearts lie in France have died, people will only see the awful ugliness of fields of white crosses. If the battlefields could be turned into beautiful gardens with one monument, I think it would be a nobler memorial to the gallant men who died to save all that is best in the world." She was determined, this is toward the end of the war, and she was determined that she kept asking, "Can you find out exactly where Eric is buried?" And so he tried to do that, and at one point, Eric Eyre's body was exhumed and moved to another cemetery, and he wrote her about that. And she and her mother-in-law did want to go and see the grave. The family believes that they did visit the grave. Whether she did before she returned back to Newfoundland, I'm not 100% sure. I mentioned already Ethel Dickinson. This is the Dickinson Memorial, which is in Cavendish Square, right in front of the old Newfoundland Hotel, which is now, I always get them confused, the hotel names, the Newfoundland Hotel. And the other person that died on duty is Bertha Bartlett. She's the only woman who's buried among the Newfoundland soldiers in the Newfoundland section of the cemetery at Wandsworth, and she also died of Spanish flu treating them. Sybil also had flu toward the end of her service. After the war, the other question that I often get asked is, what about these women after the war? And I wish I knew more. Most seem to have resumed their lives with little apparent change in their pre-war plans. As in Canada, VADs did not show any interest in continuing their nursing experience. Johnson married Brian Dunfield as she had planned. Actually, he was not taking any chances. He was waiting in New York when she crossed. And her parents were there and maybe a couple of other people. And that was the extent of her wedding, which kind of surprised me because here she was this quite high society, romantic young woman. I'm sure she would have liked to have a great big wedding, but he was waiting there in New York. As in Canada, as it says, she married Brian Dunfield as she planned. They lived in St. John's where they raised their 3 children. Frances Clewett upgraded her teaching qualifications and returned to assume control of the school in Valorum. She was known as an excellent, though demanding, teacher, and she was a force in her community. She never married, but helped her widowed brother Arthur raise his son. Bertha Forsey married a decorated Newfoundland war veteran and moved to Saskatoon. She retired from nursing to raise her 4 children and became active in community affairs. In 1939, she proudly donned her uniform and was presented to the King and Queen when they visited Saskatoon. Jeanette Coltis also donned her uniform for a royal visit and was very proud to have a royal visit. And both of these women, their children served in World War II. Two of Bertha Forsey's sons served in World War II, and her daughter Grace followed in her mother's footsteps, became a nurse, and served overseas in the Second World War. She recalled that all that was done with her mother's encouragement. But I do wonder, kind of in conclusion, about these women, were they the same wives and mothers and teachers and nurses that they would have been had they not had that experience? How much did it shape them and their experience of things? I don't have any evidence that any of them became an active pacifist. Margaret Dooley, you should read her new book on her biography of her aunt, Margaret Dooley, and she talks about the war's influence on her aunt in that direction. I can't really see it in any of the women that I've noticed, but as I say, I don't have a lot of the post-war stuff. The work that they undertook likely marked them pretty deeply, though. As Clewett put it, this is a wicked world, mother. You cannot realize what sufferings there are. Some of the misery will ever live in my memory. It seems to me now as though I shall always have sad sights in my eyes. So that was a common sentiment of women who cared for servicemen in the Great War. But so too was Jeanette Coltis's conclusion that it was the happiest time of her life. She said during World War II she wished she'd been a bit younger so she could sign up again. So for most of them, it was a very short interval, and it's hard to speculate about their lives after. But as I said this afternoon on the radio interview, the thing that always struck me is that I was asked, like, what did they know? You know, what do you think their expectations were in 1914? And of course, you know, everybody was kind of innocent going in 1914. But what struck me is that these women who had seen so much suffering 20 years later were told to do their patriotic duty and not stand in the way of their sons enlisting. You know, despite the war to end all wars, that 20 years later, they were sending their sons off to another war. And that's one of the sort of last images as I read their words I think about. Thank you.
So I'm getting some of theirs. Thank you very much, Terry. That was very interesting. And I'm sure there are some people in this room who probably have relatives who were VADs or were nurses either during the First World War or the Second World War. And just out of interest, my mother was a nurse in the Second World War, and some of the letters, she didn't have any letters, but some of the things she said were almost exactly as they were saying in the First World War. Mm-hmm. It's no different. Mm-hmm. She lost a brother and a cousin in the Second World War. Mm-hmm. So it's the same wording, even though it's funny how what war does to people. However, now's the time for questions. Online, if you want to, please. go on the chat line, and I'm going to give you the microphone, John, so you can tell everyone what the question is.
Okay. Hello, this is John Joy. I had a question about Sir Brian Dunfield. You said that that there's quite a collection of letters from Sybil Johnson. Were there any letters from Sybil Johnson to Dunfield?
I'm sure she talks about writing to Brian. And I've looked briefly in his collection. I haven't seen any. We've been looking for them. These are in the Johnson family collection. So these are her parents' property. And that's who donated them. So I haven't seen any of the letters she wrote to Brian.
You've looked at Sir Brian's collection too, and there's just nothing there.
No.
Yeah. You were mentioning.
It wasn't as sentimental as her.
No, maybe not. Anyway, one of the things that Sir Brian Dunfield was doing was, you mentioned the revised statutes of Newfoundland, but really his major work was in editing the Newfoundland Law Reports. He edited more volumes of the Newfoundland Law Reports than anyone else. And I mean, if it wasn't for Sir Brian Dunfield, we wouldn't have what we call the Newfoundland Law Reports right now. But I'm not sure how much that was connected to the...
Yeah, initially she had said, you know, his mother is dependent on him and that kind of thing. But then it did come down to his work and the assignments he had been given that were considered very vital.
Any other hands? My goodness, a quiet bunch tonight. Yes, one moment.
Thank you. That was a really interesting presentation. I really enjoyed it. I'm wondering, have you ever been asked to speak to the Mond School of Nursing?
Not on this subject, no. I've spoken to them in the past on other. I have a great interest in the history of nursing generally. I've written some things myself and supervised. I wrote about a pre-Nightingale nurse who was the first matron of the General Hospital. Heidi, I supervised Heidi's, no, did I supervise that? No, that was your master's on the Association of Registered Nurses of Newfoundland. Heidi's written on that. I supervised an MA student who wrote about the opening of the School of Nursing at Mond. So one of these days we need to pull it together because I think nursing history is amazing. And it's, you know, going from, you know, at the time when they were considered, oh, this is just women's natural role to, you know, this tough union. I think that's the next story that needs to be done is the story of the union.
I hope you will be asked to present because this was really interesting. Yeah, thank you.
I just wondered if there was a special memorial to it in Bullorem.
I know I have seen a picture of a welcome arch when she returned. In a lot of places, the names are on memorials and churches and that kind of thing, but I don't think there's particularly a memorial to her. No. I know Bertha Bartlett's name, I think, is on a church plaque in Brigus, but I don't know that. No. Even the Dickinson Memorial, which people sometimes say, well, that's a memorial to all the nurses and VADs. If you read it, it really says about, you know, for service during suffering during, you know, the Great Spanish Flu, which beset this island. But I think her story that's only part of what her story is and why she succumbed to that.
Any further questions? Okay. People online are very quiet tonight. Ah, yes. Yes, okay. This is from online.
So the first one says, thank you so much. This was so interesting. Do you know if there is any connection between VADs and the suffragists?
Okay, that's in the British literature. They say that the suffragists weren't interested in the VADs at all. They ignored them. They were, you know, upper class, you know, girls that they had no time for them. And of course, the war very much divided the suffragettes in Britain about whether they should, you know, because I mean, part of the whole argument for women getting the vote is they would make a better world. So there was a lot of dissension within the ranks in Britain. You don't see that here. Here, the women's movement that was well underway by the time the war did not create the demand for the suffrage. It helped the cause quite a bit. They followed some advice from sort of international associations, which advised women to sort of put their own demands kind of on the back burner during the war to do what they thought was best for the war effort. And here you do see, a very all-out effort for the war. As far as the VADs go, there was like the Air Girls were second, if not third generation feminists and came home and were involved in the movement. Armin Gosling Jr., she had no choice but to be a suffragette. But you don't really see anything in, and I can't imagine that Fanny Clute was not a supporter, but I certainly haven't seen anything in Sybil's to say one way or the other. The local the Women's Patriotic Association, which was the main sort of coordinating body of women's efforts on the home front, and the book that Pat mentioned, Sisterhood of Suffering and Service, terrible title, that my article on nurses and VADs is in, also contains an article called The Unquiet Knitters of Newfoundland by Margot Dooley, which talks about the effort on the home front. And the WPA published a magazine called The Distaff, and there are 2 issues of it. And in there, so they kind of put their demand for the vote on the back burner, but it's there all through it, talking about women's contribution. And so they certainly did highlight the work of nurses and VADs, often having their pictures in there and little stories about them to kind of show, that women were doing their part. And after the war, it certainly did change a lot of minds. So by the end of the war, they had the Great War Veterans Association on their side, for example. All of the St. John's members, they had the major newspapers, several of whom, their own sons had been involved in the war. So certainly the work that these women did help to change some minds and further the cause of women getting the vote. Then they just had to get by Richard Squires and home again.
There's another one that says, thanks very much, Terry. In speaking about the transition into professionalization for nurses, what do you think nurses' war work contributed to their professional status in the province?
I think in the province they were held in pretty high regard. Again, it was a very small number. I think there had been maybe 30 graduates by the time of 1914 from the School of Nursing here. Again, other Newfoundland women had trained elsewhere. And certainly Mary Southcott herself, who was the founder of the School of Nursing, was certainly held in quite high regard. So they did start a professional association, and Southcott, she did lose some control over the School of Nursing, but she did manage to kind of maintain the standards. It was copied very much on the Nightingale model of training. So I'm not sure that it did all that much for the nurses here. As I say, in Britain, it was a very fraught time. And the leadership was divided about whether even they wanted a registry of nurses. So I think there it did perhaps help to advance the cause. I don't really see it happening a lot here because they were already a pretty well respected, though new, profession.
Another question, maybe being a little bit cynical, but did any of them find husbands over there?
Right? Oh,
Did
yes, they
find
did.
husbands?
Yeah, they did. That quote from Sybil about, the sisters think we all came here to capture one of these young gods. That's exactly what Jill did. So she had broken at least 2 patients' hearts by the time she quit. And then she did meet, fall in love over there and meet a patient married over there. So yeah, there's lots of examples of that. Yeah, many of them did marry. Once the nurses in particular, once they married, they were supposed to leave. But I think there was at least one of them, might have been Cron, that got married late in the war. And because they still needed people, they gave her a special dispensation to continue nursing. So yeah, that happened a lot. Armin Gosling married during the war, young Armin, and that one didn't work out. She ended up divorcing, and I was talking about people afterwards. I forgot to mention about Armin. She did remarry later, but she became a novelist. She wrote a couple of novels. So
Interesting. I know that just out of interest's sake, my mother met my father in a hospital during the war and married him. And when they came back, she got off the boat in Newfoundland, and 2 days later, she was offered a job. And my father says, "You're not going to work." He said, "That's what you think." She said, "I'm a professional. I'm going to work." And she did her whole career.
thank you.
So thank you very much. Very interesting, and brings to light things that people don't even think about. But it is part of our history. It's what our grandparents, some people, great-grandparents, great-aunts, they were involved in this. They knew people that were involved in this, and they saw what it did to them. Letters say so much from the soul, and that's why this is so important, that it gets actually into the person who's actually writing it. And I notice there's a project now on letters to Smallwood, been done by the Historical Society. It has done the same thing. It has got into the minds of the people who, at the time of Confederation, or time before the vote or just after, what they really thought. The history books talk about the politicians, but the letters talk about the people. Okay.
Historian as an excuse to read other people's mail.
Anyway, thank you very much, Terry. And I would ask everyone to keep to the website, and you'll find out about next month's talk. So thank you very much for attending on this cold but beautiful evening. Thank you.